In this module, you will learn about SQL Azure. Microsoft SQL Azure is a cloud-based database service from Microsoft. SQL Azure offers all the database management services that you have in an on-premises Microsoft SQL Server without requiring a local physical infrastructure. In this lesson, you'll learn what SQL Azure is, what the key concepts of SQL Azure are, and what the distinctions between SQL Azure and on-premises SQL are, and finally, how to connect to SQL Azure with SQL Server Management Studio. First, let's see what SQL Azure is. SQL Azure gives you a robust relational database in the cloud, which can be used to serve both local and cloud-based applications. Storing data locally means buying physical servers and database software, installing them, and maintaining them. And if you require high availability and disaster recovery, that means more hardware, software, and maintenance. And an easy way to avoid all this installation and maintenance is to use SQL Azure. SQL Azure is the database component of Microsoft's Windows Azure platform, and it works differently by hosting your database in Microsoft data centers, which means instead of individual databases on different servers, the databases in SQL Azure are distributed among different nodes, so there is no need to install, set up, patch, physically administer, or maintain anything. Instead of buying the hardware, you pay for the database consumption. And high availability and fault tolerance are already built into SQL Azure. For example, SQL Azure makes copies of your databases automatically, so if something happens to the machine that your database is on, there is an identical copy which is ready to be activated and used. And since there is no administrative overhead of installing the software and maintenance of the hardware, when you need to scale up or down, it can be done quickly and cost-effectively using SQL Azure. One of the goals of SQL Azure is to remove the need to manage physical servers, including the operating system, from database management, which lets administrators primarily focus on the logical management of the SQL Server. In contrast, in an on-premises deployment, administrators focus in split between the logical management and the physical management of the server. The abstraction of physical servers from logical servers is a key factor in differentiating which features of SQL Server are supported by SQL Azure. For example, SQL Azure does not support access to the server's file system, which means that the database creation statements that reference to local files on an on-premises server will need to be modified to run in SQL Azure. But from the perspective of the SQL Server query writer, SQL Azure operates just like a traditional on-premises SQL Server. For example, you'll be able to write select queries against tables and views, and invoke functions and stored procedures against databases hosted in the SQL Azure just as you would do locally. SQL Azure is a rapidly developing toolset which includes database management, reporting, and data sync services with import-export capabilities in development. We need to remember that SQL Azure is a moving target, so any of the information that you learn in this module may change. Now let's learn some of the key concepts in SQL Azure. Beyond the relational database engine provided by SQL Azure, it is necessary to understand the model behind the Azure platform so that you can set up your own account, provision a server, and create databases. There is a relationship between three core objects in SQL Azure: the account, the server, and the database. Accounts are the unit of subscription and billing. All Azure activity is metered out and assigned to an account. You'll first create an account and then add servers. An Azure account may have 0 or more servers. The next object is a SQL Azure server. A server which belongs to an account are provisioned and assigned a DNS name, administrator account, and firewall rules. SQL Azure servers may have 0 or more databases. And then the third object, which is the SQL Azure database, is just like an on-premises SQL Server database, which is a container for database objects such as tables, views, functions, procedures, as well as user security accounts. Unlike on-premises SQL Server, SQL Azure does not expose system databases other than the master database. So, the process of creating a SQL Azure database begins at the account level. Due to the relationship between account, server, and the database, operations that span databases or span servers are not supported in SQL Azure. You need to carefully evaluate your on-premises applications to see if they even need to be migrated to SQL Azure. Now let's see some of the distinctions between SQL Azure and on-premises SQL Server. Security management. On an on-premises SQL Server, logins are created at instance level, and they're mapped to Windows accounts or groups. But in SQL Azure, administrative accounts are created in Azure Management Portal, and there is no concept of instance-level user logins. On an on-premises SQL Server, firewalls are managed on a physical server using operating system commands, typically limited to opening up well-known ports. In SQL Azure, by default, there is no access to the databases except through the management portal. Specific IP addresses and ranges must be allowed to connect to these databases. And the next difference is the authentication mechanism. In an on-premises SQL Server, you can choose between Windows authentication and SQL Server authentication. But for SQL Azure, SQL Server authentication is the only mechanism that is supported. Hardware management. In an on-premises SQL Server, administrators have access to a wide range of monitoring and other types of tools in order to manage low-level resource usage, backups, and disaster recoveries. But in SQL Azure, there is very limited access to server-level information due to the abstraction model, and there is no support for backup and restores. In addition to all of these differences, not all SQL Server database engine features are supported by SQL Azure, including multi-database and multi-server capabilities. Now that you've learned about the key concepts of SQL Azure and the distinctions between on-premises SQL Server and SQL Azure, now let's see how to connect to SQL Azure using SQL Server Management Studio. Although the process to connect to a SQL Azure database is quite similar to connecting to an on-premises SQL Server database, there are some differences. You need to specify the SQL Azure server's four-part name while connecting to it. And in the authentication box, you need to choose SQL Server Authentication because connecting to SQL Azure using Windows Authentication is not supported. By default, you will connect to the master database. So to connect to a user database instead, click the Options button to expand the Connect to Server box and reveal the Connections Properties panel, which you can use to enter the name of the desired database. Remember that once a connection to a user database is made, you cannot switch to another database without disconnecting and reconnecting to the next database. Switching from the master database to a user database is supported by Management Studio's user interface, but not in the code with the use statement. Now let's see how to connect to SQL Azure using SQL Server Management Studio. Click on Connect, click on Database Engine, and then in the server name box, you need to specify the server name, .database.windows.net, and in the authentication box, you need to specify SQL Server Authentication. And in the login box, you need to specify the account that you're going to use to connect to the server and type in the password. Click on Connect, and now it is connected to the SQL Azure server. Expand the databases, and as you can see, you have one database called SQL Operations. Now let's expand the system databases. And as you can see, Master is the only database that we can see here. Unlike on-premises SQL Server, SQL Azure does not expose system databases other than the master database. Now let's see how to connect to the SQL Operations database directly from the Connect to Server dialog box. Let's type in the password. Click on Options. Click on the Connect to Database. You can browse the server and select SQL Operations Database, click on OK, and then click on Connect. Now when you open a new query, the database that you see is SQL Operations. And once you're connected to a database on SQL Azure, you can perform any of the T-SQL operations just like you would do on an on-premises SQL server. You can create tables, views, use functions, and store procedures, etc.